Hi, everyone. My name is Maya Nair. I am on the growth team here at Encord, and I'm excited to be joined by Ulrich, Encord's president and co-founder. We'll be taking a look at AI regulation and specifically the AI Act. So quickly to go over the agenda, we will be diving into the AI Act in detail. We'll run through a few case studies, and we'll get to some Q&A at the end if we have time. But before that, let's give a little bit of background on Encord, what we do, and where we are coming from. Quick disclosure, this is all for general information and educational purposes and is not intended to be legal advice. Great. So we are Encord, the complete data engine for AI model development. That starts with our annotation platform and labeling tool, all the way through to our model and data debugging toolkit. For each stage of the model development process, you need to make sure that you have correct specification to the problem that you're trying to solve. And our data engine, composed of our suite products, Encord Annotate, Active, and Apollo, helps you build trustworthy and compliant AI applications. We are working with companies from startups to enterprises and helping them navigate pre-production to post-production model development. Ulrich, if you go to the next slide, perfect. So taking a step back, artificial intelligence suffers from what is commonly referred to as a black box problem, meaning that decision-making of these AI systems is opaque and there's little to no clarity on how AI actually functions. This is leading to a fundamental distrust in artificial intelligence and consequently driving the speed, the content, and the intensity of AI regulations. Around the world, we're seeing governments scramble to put in place guardrails around these models to enforce transparency, especially in higher risk use cases. We go to the next slide. As we're all aware, AI regulation is quite a hot button topic at the moment. Lots of industry leaders are entering the public discourse around AI regulation, notably Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Sam Altman, all signed the AI statement of risk, along with a whole host of other industry leaders. Sam Altman also is going on a bit of a AI regulation world tour, if you will, where he spoke to Congress about the risks of artificial intelligence and urged lawmakers to put in place regulation. We saw days later, he floated the idea of seizing operations in the EU based on the definition of high-risk systems. And then once again, days later, he had to walk back those statements. We're seeing this sort of back and forth as the discourse around AI regulation begins to take shape. But the general consensus seems to be that AI regulation is necessary and inevitable at this point. With that, I will hand it over to Ulrich, who will dive into the details of the AI Act.
Thanks, Maya. So yes, now on to the European AI Act, which of course is the star of our show today. So just 1 month ago, so early June, the European Parliament voted to adopt the AI Act, which marks the world's first piece of legislation on artificial intelligence. Now, it'll be at least 24 months before the AI Act is ratified, which means that it is likely to enter into force in 2025, similar to how GDPR also took a few years from adoption. The legislation basically covers anyone supplying AI systems into the European single market. So if you're a US company, you're selling into the European market, you would be on the hook on this regulation. And it intends to ban systems with so-called unacceptable levels of risk and establish guardrails for developing and deploying AI systems into production, particularly in these high-risk scenarios. So to that effect, they've chosen to adopt this risk-based obligation framework that we'll get into a little bit later, which basically means that the stringency of the requirements you are subject to for developing AI applications scales with the EU's definition of risk. So the risk of the application, the harder the set of requirements you will have for developing and deploying AI systems. And similar to what we've seen in the past with breaches of the GDPR regulation, the stakes here are quite substantial, with fines that can be up to 6% of your global annual turnover. So of course, you're a big tech company, that's can be quite a substantial amount of money. Now, what's interesting about the AI Act and how we ended up here is actually that the European Commission initially adopted a more of like a soft law approach with a set of non-binding ethics guidelines that were released all the way back in 2019. But then, of course, shifted to a more legislative approach that we're seeing now, initially with the release of a white paper on AI back in 2020, which then since turned into the initial AI Act proposal, which was released in 2021. So while the Act has just recently hit the headlines and captured people's attention after it's been adopted, it's actually been cooking for a couple of years in the background. And I think, interestingly, they ended up also amending it, the entire text, including new articles to account for foundation and generative models after ChatGPT was released in November. And that's a relatively recent addition. It was only done back in May, basically like a couple of weeks before the Act was adopted by the European Parliament. The Act has a defined set of objectives, which the European Parliament believes to be our roadmap to a safer and more innovative AI landscape in the EU. And it basically seeks to promote secure, law-abiding AI and unifying the market in Europe to ensure a level playing field with trustworthy AI applications for everyone. The EU AI Act is groundbreaking in many ways. Of course, one of the reasons is it's the first, but also because it provides a legal definition of artificial intelligence, which is also the first legal definition of AI, which, of course, for the AI practitioners, as they would know, has been a hot topic of debate in academia for quite a few years. So we've listed it here. I'm not going to read it out. The AI Act also adds definitions for what are called general purpose AI systems, foundation and generative models. Again, these were the ones that were adopted after ChatGPT was released in November. And you can think of these as being different from fixed purpose AI systems, as they can be adapted to a wide range of different tasks. These definitions are not the most interesting, but they are quite important, as they do determine what bucket you might fall into, and therefore also what obligations you might have as a AI developer. So the set of requirements you have to comply with are different if you're a foundation model developer than if you're a general purpose AI system developer, and different still to being a fixed purpose AI system developer. So now that's a lot of different words and definitions there. So this is really where it gets quite tricky. We've tried to construct this decision tree based on our current understanding of the regulation. It's actually quite difficult to find the complete text online. It's a bunch of amendments, and there's like the original text and so on and so forth. So finding out like what's the crux of the regulation is actually more difficult than you'd think. And what you'll notice looking at the chart here is that there is a set of always required obligations for general purpose AI system, foundation model, and Gen AI developers, irrespective of whether they are deemed high risk or not. So if you zoom in on the foundation model developer portion of the chart here, you'll see that these developers will have to do things like disclose how much compute, so the total training time, the model size, compute power, and so on, and also measure the energy consumption used to train the model. And similar to high-risk AI system developers, and we'll get into those a little bit later, they also have to conduct conformity assessments. They have to register the model in a database in the European Union. They have to do technical audits and so on and so forth. And if you're a Gen AI developer, you have to document and also disclose any use of copyrighted training data. So the days of OpenAI scraping all of the internet and using Reddit and Twitter and so on for training these large models is going to be basically prohibited under this, or at least like you have to disclose it under this new regulation here. So zooming in on the risk-based obligation framework that we've been talking about, the main thing to call out is the high-risk AI system category, which are AI systems that can create so-called adverse impact on people's safety or their fundamental rights, which introduces a number of requirements that also apply to developers of foundation models around things like data governance, auditability. You have to register the model in a database, as you will with foundation models and so on. The entire set of requirements are a bit too lengthy to go over here. They cover a substantial part of the actual legal documents. We will go over a case study later where we'll touch on some of the exact requirements, but we'll leave it relatively high level. Now, the EU has stated that most AI systems will not be high risk, and these actually don't carry any mandatory obligations. So the provisions and the obligations for developers, they mainly center around the high risk systems. And again, if you're building generative or foundation models or general purpose AI systems. And with that, I'll pass it back over to Maya, who will introduce some of our case studies.
Great, thanks, Ulrich. We would be remiss not to at least mention other AI regulation proposals around the world. We're seeing the US has initially taken a lenient approach towards AI, but calls for regulation have been recently mounting. Chinese regulators are consulting on a proposal to regulate AI. The UK is working on a set of pro-innovation regulatory principles. And at the international level, the OECD adopted a non-binding recommendation on AI in 2019. And similarly, UNESCO adopted recommendations on AI in 2021. All of the nations on the slide are at various stages of evolving their approach to AI regulation, and these all warrant a deeper dive. So we will leave it at that for now, but perhaps a webinar for another day, Ulrich. So with that, let's dive into some case studies. Great. So our hypothetical French company, Motion Script, is building a text-to-video model to create avatars that can replace television news anchors. Ulrich, what do they have to keep in mind, and what are they on the hook for, especially as a developer of a model that has downstream use cases out of their control?
That's a great question. So first and foremost, they are a French startup, which means that they are inside the European Union, which means that there's no way around the regulation. Interestingly, this is what we considered a limited risk type scenario. So for Gen AI developers, they have to comply with these transparency obligations, which are listed in Article 52. So they basically have to disclose if the content that they are displaying to the user has been artificially generated or manipulated, irrespective of whether they are an implementer or the actual developer. They also have to apply safeguards against generating content, which would be in breach of union law. So you can imagine that Gen AI models can generate various types of content. It can also be explicit content. It could be hate speech, or it could be something else. They would have to basically make sure that the models are unable to generate that type of content listed in this and these sets of regulation. And again, as we went over before, they'd also have to document and disclose all the use of copyrighted training data, so that if they have scraped, for argument's sake, YouTube or other video that they've used, which would be copyrighted, they'd have to list that in the disclosure documents of the model. So that's a whole another level of documentation required for releasing these types of models into the market.
Great, thanks, Ulrich. So second scenario, we have another hypothetical company, this time an American company, Neurodetect that is building a model to detect ischemic strokes in MRI brain scans. And they're looking to sell to the largest German hospital, so into the EU market. What do they have to be cognizant of?
This is also, I think, a very interesting case study. So Neurodetect is an American company. If they were only operating in the US, they wouldn't necessarily have to comply with the regulation, but because they are looking to supply their model into the European market, so to the largest German hospital specifically, they would be on the hook for the regulation. This would be generally considered a high-risk use case because medical algorithms would typically fall in this medical device category, which falls under the European Health and Safety Harmonization legislation, which are all considered a high risk in the language of the AI Act. So being a high-risk AI system, and again, this is what I talked about before, there are like a long set of obligations that you have to basically comply with. They cover Articles 8 to 15. You can go and read those in the original text. You also have to register the model in a EU database. And given that these guys are based in the US and selling into the European market, they also have to apply an authorized representative to do this conformity assessment. So they basically have to apply this almost like an AI auditor to go in and check that they have met all the regulations. So quite an interesting use case, and definitely adds a bit of extra complexity for American companies selling into Europe. And I just quickly want to highlight two of the articles that I think are of particular interest for us as a data company and, of course, as data scientists. The first one being Article 10 around data and governance. So the data and governance piece basically says that you have to do things like training, validation, and testing data have to be relevant, representative, free of errors, and complete. So that's pretty vaguely defined and probably also going to be very difficult to comply with, but it is nonetheless something that you have to keep in mind when you are developing and building a model. So you have to do these things, you have to be able to document them, you have to be able to prove that you have created a data set, again, that is representative, free of errors and biases and so on. So these regulations actually look somewhat similar to the FDA regulations of getting medical AI algorithms through the FDA approval process, which I think is a very interesting development because we haven't seen that before in a European context, at least not in the exact same way. The second one is around human oversight. So you might think that AI systems are intended and designed to be run completely autonomously, so without any sort of like human intervention, interaction. But the Article 14 human oversight article actually states that you do need to have human oversight. So you have to do spot checks to make sure that the AI system is working in accordance with its intended purpose, and it is not being misused and not making errors and so on and so forth. So I think this is also a very interesting one because a lot of the tooling that you need to build out to be able to comply with this regulation, of course, are like a few commercial vendors in the market, but will be in even greater necessity in the future. So specifically for our annotation product, this would be a perfect solution for solving this type of problem, for example. And I think with that, we'll pass it over to Maya to go over the last case study.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Ulrich. We have one last interesting scenario. So another company called Emotion AI is building emotion recognition models initially intended for VR video games, but they receive a call from UK border management about using the technology at the UK border. What are the considerations there?
Yes, I think this is also a very interesting case study because of the emotion recognition systems are generally considered limited risk. So they are not prohibited. You can still use them in like various contexts. So I think for the immersive video game experience that these guys have been building initially. And also border control management is considered a high-risk area under the terms of the regulation. So looking at both of them together, it should theoretically be feasible, but because the emotion recognition system is deployed in a border management scenario, it is deemed unacceptable risk by the regulation, and therefore it is banned. So this is also why context matters quite a bit in the regulation. So you can find different scenarios, different types of software, and also different combinations of the scenarios and the types of software would be banned under the language of the regulation. So again, quite an interesting use case for this specific company here, and unfortunately not be able to supply that under the terms of the regulation.
Great, thanks, Ulrich. So we have some time to answer some questions. We received quite a few prior to the webinar, and I also see a few questions that have come in live. So let's dive right in. First question, do the restrictions apply to those deploying out-of-the-box open source ML models?
Yes, that is actually a great question, because if you look at the language of the regulation, both open and closed source models are covered. But what matters is who is deploying them. So if you are an AI company and you're taking an open source model and deploying it in a high-risk scenario, you as the AI company deploying the model would be liable to make sure that it complies with these like high-risk obligations. Whereas for if you're just developing the open source model and putting it on the market, given that it's not a general purpose AI system or a foundation model or a gen AI model, you would not. So there is like some nuance there, but I think that's a great question.
Okay, second question, what impact will this have on North American companies, if any? And assuming this is referring to the AI Act.
Yes, that's also a great question. We covered it somewhat in the one of the case studies that we have, but if you're an American-based AI company, and if you are supplying AI into the European Union, and I can see there's also a live question here, the difference between end users and customers, the distinction doesn't really matter. It's if you're supplying any sort of AI service used by someone within the European Union, it can be for commercial purpose or not. You have to comply with the regulation if it is a high risk or foundation model or Gen AI model.
Great. And then a somewhat related question, which I can take, Ulrich, is how might the EU AI Act shape and influence US policy? So the AI Act is now the precedent, so it will influence US policy to an extent. Another major influence will be industry leaders. For example, we referenced Sam Altman, who visited Congress urging for regulation. But there's obviously, in his case, he has his own motives as the creator of a generative AI product. He won't want such strict guidelines around generative AI. The US also recently formed a bipartisan national commission to determine the best path forward. So that will also be the main driver of US policy going forward. Okay, couple more questions. How should companies interpret unacceptable levels of risk?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. So we actually have the prohibited AI practices listed here. Again, these are high level. In the regulation, there are like more cases. So if they're deployed, as mentioned before, for law enforcement purposes or in border control systems or whatnot, AI systems might be prohibited, similar to like what the case study showed before. So this is not an exhaustive list. You have to read through the fine print of the regulation to understand like what all the prohibited AI practices might be, because it is somewhat more extensive than we have listed here. This is a quick overview.
Great. Next question, will regulations be stratified by risk-based classifications as is done for medical device standards?
Yes, also a great question. We've touched on that in the risk-based application framework. Again, any of the types of applications that might fall into these health and safety category, so a lot of that is medical devices, would be deemed high risk. There are also like plenty others. So for like education, there are also like some prohibited practices. For example, you're not allowed to use emotion recognition software in education. But you might want to apply things like a grading system, automated grading system for like academic papers or essays and whatnot. Those all fall into this like high risk category.
Okay, great. One more question I think we can take, just looking at the time. What does the emerging product safety testing framework look like? For example, LLMs will fall into a high risk bucket. What should be disclosed about the models and how can we ensure the outputs are safe?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think there's still some room for interpretation in the Act when you read through it now. Again, going back to some of the specific requirements that we talked about earlier, I've tried to extract the AI requirements for foundation models. This is actually from a Stanford paper. They tried to extract all the different requirements and like what they actually mean from a practical implementation standpoint. So there are like quite a few here. Some of them we've already talked about. So data governance, compute, energy, and you have to basically apply all of these like different criteria and requirements on the model building process. So there is quite a bit of stuff to comply with. And I think interestingly, the Stanford AI lab also graded the various types of foundation models. So I think ChatGPT is a good example of that, or GPT-4 from OpenAI is a good example of that. We can actually see here in this risk assessment framework that none of the models are compliant. I think there are like some that are worse than others. So I think if you look at the model from Anthropic, for example, it looks like they have quite a bit of work. So if you're looking at cloud, they have quite a bit of work for making sure that it would be compliant with the draft EU AI Act, as opposed to Hugging Face's Bloom model, for example. So there is a lot of work to be done in that regard. Do you want to take a few questions for the audience, Maya, maybe for the last 5 minutes? I see there are a couple popping up here. The first one is, will this be recorded, shared after the meeting? I don't know if you're planning to share it.
Yes, I believe that is the plan.
Got it. Excellent. I can also take the next one, maybe. Do you need to disclose as AI generated content if a human has reviewed and edited the generated content on the EU AI Act? So reading through the actual documents, again, this is I think there is some nuance here, but the answer would most likely be yes. It's saying that you still have to disclose if it has been manipulated or generated by AI, no matter if it's edited by human afterwards. But I would definitely encourage you to read through the legislation there, because it is somewhat of an edge case, or somewhat difficult to understand based on just what's in the documentation. Are there any of the other questions on your end, Maya, that you would like to address?
No, I think that I think we covered most of them. Yeah, I think I'm all set on my end, Ulrich.
Excellent. Well, really appreciate everybody for jumping on today. We will be sharing the recording afterwards. If you have any specific questions you'd like to address in a more one-on-one scenario, feel free to email us. We spend quite a bit of time reading through the documents and the regulations, so happy to share any insights that we may have on that. And yeah, I think over to you to end the webinar.